Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're journeying to the banks of the Nile, to a time when gods walked among reeds and papyrus, when the written word held magic, and when the moon itself was a divine eye watching over creation. We're exploring the complete story of Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, writing, and secrets untold. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. In the beginning, before the pyramids pierced the sky, before hieroglyphs adorned temple walls, before pharaohs claimed divine right, there was Thoth. His name in ancient Egyptian was Jehuti, pronounced something like Jhoot, though the exact sound has been lost to millennia. The Greeks would later call him Thoth, and it's this name that has echoed through history, carrying with it the weight of 5,000 years of reverence, mystery, and transformation. To understand Thoth is to understand the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. He was not simply one god among many in the vast Egyptian pantheon. He was the architect of reality itself, the one who spoke the names of all things and in doing so brought them into being. He was the measurer of time, the keeper of cosmic balance, the scribe who recorded every deed of every god and every mortal. He was, in many ways, the mind of the universe made manifest. But who was Thoth, really? Where did he come from? The ancient Egyptians themselves told many stories about his origins, and each one reveals something different about his nature and his role in the cosmos. Unlike gods such as Ra or Osiris, whose births and parentage were relatively clear in Egyptian mythology, Thoth's origins remain deliberately mysterious, shrouded in the same enigmatic quality that defined his entire existence. One tradition held that Thoth was self-created, that he came into being through the power of his own word. In this telling, he simply spoke himself into existence, an act that perfectly embodied his role as the god of speech and creative utterance. The Egyptians believed that words held power, that to name something was to give it reality, and Thoth was the supreme master of this art. His self-creation through speech was not arrogance but a demonstration of the fundamental principle he represented. Language creates reality, knowledge gives birth to existence, and wisdom is the mother of all being. Another origin story placed Thoth's birth at the very beginning of time, emerging from the primordial waters of Nun alongside Ra, the sun god. In this version, when Ra first rose from the waters and began the work of creation, Thoth was already there, a companion and counselor from the very first moment. This story emphasizes Thoth's role as the divine intellect that guided creation, the wisdom that shaped the raw power of the sun into ordered cosmos. Ra might have been the force of creation, but Thoth was its architect, its planner, its geometer. Yet another tradition tells of Thoth's birth in a more violent and dramatic fashion, emerging from the conflict between two of Egypt's most powerful deities. This is the story of the eternal struggle between Horus and Set, the battle between order and chaos that formed one of the central myths of Egyptian religion. In this telling, during one of their fierce battles, Set struck Horus and damaged his eye, the sacred eye of Horus that represented wholeness, health, and royal power. According to some accounts, from the pain and injury of this divine combat, from the mingling of Horus's blood and tears, Thoth was born. In other versions of the myth, Thoth emerged from Set's forehead after Set accidentally swallowed semen from Horus during their contests, a golden disc that became the moon god himself. Or in another variation, Thoth emerged from the head of Set himself, born from the god of chaos, much as Athena would later spring from Zeus's head in Greek mythology. This birth linked Thoth forever to both order and disorder, to the balance between the two forces. He was born from conflict but became the great mediator, the one who could stand between opposing powers and bring them into equilibrium. Some texts describe Thoth as the son of Ra, created by the sun god's divine utterance. Others call him the heart of Ra, the thinking and reasoning aspect of the supreme deity made into a separate being. This relationship between Thoth and Ra would remain central throughout Egyptian religious thought. Ra was power, light, and life. Thoth was intellect, knowledge, and law. Together they represented the complementary forces needed for creation and maintenance of the universe. In yet another tradition, particularly prominent in the city of Hermopolis, Thoth was associated with the Ogdoad, the 8 primordial deities who represented the chaotic forces that existed before creation. These 8 gods, 4 pairs of male and female deities, embodied the formless qualities of the pre-creation universe: darkness, hiddenness, infinity, and the primordial waters. From their interaction, according to the Hermopolitan theology, came the primordial mound, the first solid ground to emerge from the waters of chaos. And on this mound, or in some versions from the cosmic egg laid upon it, Thoth was born or came into being as the demiurge, the active creator who would shape the raw materials of existence into the ordered world. The multiplicity of these origin stories is not a confusion or contradiction in Egyptian thought. Rather, it reflects the Egyptian understanding that divine truth could be approached from many angles, that different aspects of a god's nature might require different myths to express them fully. Based on how these stories function in Egyptian theology, we can understand that Thoth was self-created because he embodied the power of knowledge and language to bring forth reality. He was born alongside Ra because wisdom and power must work together. He emerged from the conflict of Horus and Set because, as these myths suggest, true wisdom is born from understanding both order and chaos. He came from the primordial forces because knowledge encompasses even the unknowable. What remains consistent across all these stories is Thoth's fundamental nature. He was ancient beyond reckoning, present at the very beginning of things. He was intimately connected to the act of creation, not as raw force but as organizing principle. He was associated with boundaries and transitions, standing at the threshold between chaos and order, between the divine and the mortal, between life and death. And he was, above all, the master of words, of names, of the spoken and written language through which reality itself was shaped and understood. The Egyptians depicted Thoth in several distinct forms, each emphasizing different aspects of his nature and power. Most commonly, he appeared as a man with the head of an ibis, that elegant wading bird with its long, curved beak. The ibis was a sacred animal in Egypt, particularly associated with Thoth. Its black and white plumage suggested the duality of existence, light and dark, known and unknown. The bird's curved beak resembled both the crescent moon, one of Thoth's primary symbols, and the shape of a writing implement. Ibises were also observed to walk along the banks of the Nile in a measured, deliberate way, their movements seeming to suggest careful thought and calculation, qualities the Egyptians associated with their god of wisdom. In this ibis-headed form, Thoth was usually shown standing upright in the manner of Egyptian divine iconography, wearing the traditional white crown of Upper Egypt or sometimes a crown combining the lunar crescent and the full moon disk. In his hands he typically held the tools of his sacred craft, a writing palette and a reed pen, or sometimes a palm branch that he used to record the passage of years. The palette, called a kesu in Egyptian, was an elongated board with hollows for holding different colors of ink, usually black and red. The reed pen, made from the stems of rushes that grew along the Nile, was cut at an angle to create a brush-like tip. These simple tools, in the hands of Thoth, became instruments of cosmic power, capable of recording and thus fixing into permanent reality the deeds of gods and the fates of humanity. Thoth's second common form was equally important. He also appeared as a baboon, specifically the sacred baboon known as the Hamadryas. These baboons, with their distinctive capes of silver-gray hair, were observed by ancient Egyptians to sit at the edge of the desert in the early morning, facing east, and to chatter and call out as the sun rose. To the Egyptians, this behavior seemed like prayer or worship, as though the baboons were greeting and honoring Ra as he began his daily journey across the sky. They therefore associated baboons with solar worship and with the liminal moments of dawn and dusk, times of transition between day and night, light and darkness. The baboon was also considered a particularly intelligent animal, capable of learning and problem-solving, traits that made it a fitting symbol for the god of wisdom. In this form, Thoth was shown as a large baboon sitting on its haunches, often with a small lunar disk or crescent on its head. The baboon form emphasized Thoth's role as a witness and recorder, sitting in watchful observation of all that occurred in heaven and on earth. Sometimes, particularly in temple reliefs and papyrus illustrations, Thoth appeared in fully human form, without any animal features at all. In these depictions, he was shown as a man wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, or the Atef crown, holding his scribal equipment, distinguished from human scribes by his divine bearing and by the presence of other symbolic elements that marked him as a god. This human form emphasized Thoth's accessibility to mortals, his role as a bridge between the divine and human realms, particularly in matters of writing, learning, and the transmission of knowledge. Regardless of his form, certain symbols always accompanied Thoth. The moon, in all its phases, was his primary celestial symbol. He was called the Silver Aten, the Silver Sun, in reference to the moon being considered a nighttime counterpart to Ra's solar disk. The waxing and waning of the moon, its regular cycles and its role in marking time, perfectly embodied Thoth's association with measurement, calculation, and the ordering of time itself. The Egyptians used a lunar calendar for religious purposes, even after adopting a solar calendar for civil administration, and the careful observation and recording of the moon's phases was considered part of Thoth's sacred duty. The written word was another of his primary symbols. Every hieroglyph, every inscription, every text was under his protection and infused with his power. The hieroglyphic script itself was called the Words of the God, MDWNTR in Egyptian, and Thoth was that god, the inventor and master of writing. To be literate in ancient Egypt was to participate in Thoth's sacred art, to wield a fragment of the power that created and sustained reality. Numbers and mathematics also belonged to Thoth's domain. The Egyptians were master calculators and geometers, skills necessary for everything from building pyramids to managing agricultural production in the rhythmic cycle of Nile floods. All mathematical knowledge was considered Thoth's gift to humanity, and scribes and architects alike honored him as their patron and the source of their expertise. The number 5 held special significance for Thoth. According to one important myth, he won 5 extra days from the moon in a game of Senet, the popular Egyptian board game. These 5 days, called the apagomenal days, were added to the 360-day year to create the 365-day calendar. The myth explained not only the origin of the calendar but also demonstrated Thoth's cleverness and his role as the manipulator of time itself. In the myth, the sky goddess Nut had been cursed by Ra, who decreed that she could not give birth on any day of any month of the year. Thoth, however, gambled with the moon and won a portion of its light. Sources vary on whether this was 1/70th or 1/72nd of the moon's illumination, which was enough to create 5 new days that belonged to no month. On these days, Nut bore her 5 children: Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. Thus, Thoth's cleverness allowed the birth of some of Egypt's most important deities, and his manipulation of time itself made possible a crucial turning point in the divine order. Magic, too, was Thoth's province, though the Egyptian word Heka encompassed a broader range of meaning than our modern word magic suggests. Heka was the fundamental creative force of the universe, the power through which the gods created and maintained reality. It was natural law and supernatural power combined, the force that made things happen. Thoth, as the god of words and knowledge, was master of Heka. He knew the true names of all things, and to know a true name was to have power over that thing. His magic was not the flashy sorcery of later traditions, but something more fundamental, the power inherent in understanding, in knowledge, in the precise use of language. This magical knowledge was not kept secret from humanity. Instead, Thoth was seen as the great teacher, the one who transmitted the arts of civilization to mortals. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, magic, all these were gifts from Thoth. He taught humans how to understand and work with the forces of nature, how to heal diseases, how to track the stars, how to perform the rituals that maintained cosmic order. In this role, he was humanity's greatest benefactor, the god who lifted people from ignorance into knowledge, from chaos into understanding. The city of Kmun, known to the Greeks as Hermopolis Magna, was Thoth's principal cult center and the city most closely associated with his worship. Located in Middle Egypt, about 180 miles south of Cairo in the region the Egyptians called the Here Nome, Hermopolis was the theological center for the cosmology, in which Thoth played the central creative role. The name Kmun means 8 town, referring to the Ogdoad, the 8 primordial deities of the Hermopolitan creation myth. Here, Thoth was understood as the demiurge, the active creator who brought order from chaos, who spoke the world into being through his divine words. The city's ruins still stand today, near the modern village of El Ashmunin, though much of the ancient glory has been lost to time. In its prime, Hermopolis boasted massive temples to Thoth, sacred lakes where ibises and baboons were kept, schools for scribes where young men learned the sacred art of writing under Thoth's patronage, and archives containing countless scrolls and papyri. It was a center of learning and scholarship, where the wisest priests studied the movements of stars, composed religious texts, and preserved the accumulated knowledge of Egyptian civilization. But Thoth's influence extended far beyond Hermopolis. Every temple in Egypt had a library and scriptorium under his protection. Every school where scribes learned their craft honored him. Every legal proceeding invoked his name, for he was the god of justice and truth as well as wisdom. Every measurement, every calculation, every astronomical observation was an act of worship to Thoth. His presence permeated Egyptian society at every level, from the highest priest to the lowliest scribe, from the pharaoh's court to the village school. And at night, when the moon rose over the Nile, its silver light was understood as Thoth's watchful eye, observing all that transpired in the darkness, recording all deeds and words for the final reckoning. He was always there, always watching, always writing, the eternal scribe whose records could never be altered or destroyed, whose knowledge encompassed all that was, all that is, and all that ever would be. This was Thoth at his origins, but his story was only beginning. To understand him fully, we must delve deeper into his many roles, his countless deeds, his relationships with other gods, and the profound impact he had, not only on ancient Egypt, but on the entire course of Western civilization. For Thoth was not simply an Egyptian deity who faded when the temples fell. He transformed, evolved, and continues to influence human thought even today, more than 2,000 years after the last hieroglyph was carved in his honor. Now let us turn to the many domains over which Thoth held sway, the attributes and powers that made him one of the most complex and influential deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Thoth's role as the god of writing cannot be overstated. In a culture where writing was considered magical, where every inscription held power and every text was sacred, the god who invented and mastered this art was necessarily one of supreme importance. The Egyptians did not see writing as merely a practical tool for record-keeping or communication. Writing was heka, magic, a way of making thoughts and words permanent, of fixing reality into unchanging form. To write something down was to make it true in a deeper sense than mere spoken words could achieve. Written words endured. They could not be forgotten, could not be altered by faulty memory or deliberate distortion. They stood as eternal witnesses to truth. According to Egyptian belief, Thoth invented hieroglyphic writing. The very name hieroglyphs, meaning sacred carvings in Greek, reflects this divine origin. The Egyptians themselves called their writing system the words of the god, and that god was Thoth. He created the symbols, established the rules of grammar and syntax, and taught the first scribes how to use this powerful tool. In some texts, he was said to have created writing in order to give humanity a way to preserve knowledge and wisdom across generations. In others, writing was first invented for the gods themselves, as a way to record divine decrees and maintain cosmic order, and only later was this sacred knowledge shared with mortal scribes. The art of the scribe was one of the most prestigious professions in ancient Egypt. Scribes formed a distinct and honored class, set apart from farmers, craftsmen, and even soldiers. They were the literate elite, the ones who could read and write the sacred script, who kept the records that made Egyptian civilization function, who copied religious texts, who recorded the words of pharaohs and gods alike. And every single scribe, from the youngest student to the most senior bureaucrat, acknowledged Thoth as their patron and the source of their ability. Before beginning their work each day, scribes would pour a libation to Thoth, a few drops of water onto the ground, and say a short prayer asking for his guidance and blessing. This was not empty ritual, but sincere acknowledgement that the scribe's skill was a gift from the god, that every document they created participated in Thoth's ongoing work of maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order and truth. When scribes set up their workstations, they positioned themselves facing north, the direction associated with Thoth, and they kept small images or amulets of the god nearby, often in the form of a baboon or ibis. The tools of the scribe were sacred objects. The palette, with its cakes of black and red ink, was not just a utilitarian item but a symbol of Thoth himself. The black ink was made from carbon, often soot or charcoal, mixed with gum, arabic from acacia trees. Red ink, used for emphasis and for marking the beginning of new sections, was made from red ochre. The reed pens were carefully prepared and maintained, their tips kept at just the right angle for proper writing. And papyrus itself, the paper made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta marshes, was considered a gift from the gods, a material that made permanent writing possible. Learning to write was a long and difficult process. Young boys, usually from families that already had a tradition of literacy, began their training at about age 5 or 6. They would spend years learning the complex system of hieroglyphs, which included hundreds of different signs. Some hieroglyphs were ideograms, representing actual objects or ideas. Others were phonograms, representing sounds. Still others were determinatives, signs that clarified the meaning of a word without adding any sound. A fully literate scribe needed to know not only the signs themselves, but also the complicated rules for how they could be combined, the proper forms for different types of documents, and the specialized vocabularies used in religious, legal, and administrative texts. Students practiced by copying standard texts onto ostraca, broken pieces of pottery or flakes of limestone that served as cheap writing surfaces. They copied letters, legal documents, wisdom literature, religious hymns, mathematical problems, anything that would teach them the forms and formulas they would need in their future work. The most common practice texts were wisdom literature, collections of advice and moral teachings often attributed to famous sages of the past. These texts served double duty, teaching both writing skills and proper moral conduct. Advanced students graduated to writing on papyrus and learned the cursive script called hieratic, which was much faster to write than formal hieroglyphs and was used for most everyday documents. The very best students might even learn demotic, an even more simplified script that emerged in the late period of Egyptian history. But regardless of which script they used, all scribes understood that their ability came from Thoth, and that each document they created was a sacred act. Thoth's association with writing extended beyond the merely practical. He was said to have written books of wisdom and magic, compilations of all knowledge, texts that contained the secrets of the universe. Ancient Egyptian tradition spoke of comprehensive sacred writings, and the Greek scholar Clement of Alexandria mentions that the Egyptians possessed 42 sacred books attributed to Thoth, covering every aspect of existence, from the proper performance of religious rituals to the movements of stars, from medical treatments to magical spells, from laws and ethics to the nature of the gods themselves. Whether these represented actual distinct texts or a symbolic number reflecting the completeness of knowledge remains a matter of scholarly interpretation. No mortal could ever read all of these sacred texts, for they contained too much knowledge for a human mind to hold. But the priests studied what they could, and the most learned among them were said to have mastered several of these sacred texts. One particular legendary book attributed to Thoth gained mythical status in Egyptian tales, the Book of Thoth. Egyptian stories spoke of this as a compilation of ultimate knowledge, containing spells of incredible power, knowledge of the past and future, the ability to understand the language of animals, and the secrets of the heavens and the earth. Various ancient texts mention this book, always in tones of awe and fear, for while it promised great power, it also carried great danger. Whether this book ever existed as a physical object or represented an ideal of complete knowledge remains unknown, but the legend itself reveals how the Egyptians understood the relationship between knowledge and power. One ancient Egyptian tale illustrates the dangers of seeking forbidden knowledge. The story tells of a prince named Setna Kamwaset, based on a real historical figure who was a son of Ramesses II and high priest of Ptah, but who became in legend an archetypal seeker of dangerous wisdom. In this tale, Setna hears of the Book of Thoth, said to be hidden in the tomb of an ancient prince named Nanefer-kaptar. Driven by his desire for knowledge, Setna breaks into the tomb and finds not only the book, but the spirits of Nanefer-kaptar and his family, who warn him against taking it. The book, they explain, brought them nothing but suffering and death. But Setna, convinced that he is wiser and more powerful than those who came before, ignores the warning and takes the book. What follows is a series of disasters. Setna becomes entangled with a mysterious woman who turns out to be a spirit sent by Thoth himself to punish him. He loses his status, his family, his dignity, and nearly his life. Only when he returns the Book of Thoth to its proper place does he escape complete ruin. The story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking knowledge without wisdom, of trying to grasp power without understanding, of disrespecting the gods and their sacred mysteries. But this aspect of Thoth, the keeper of dangerous and forbidden knowledge, coexisted with his role as the generous teacher of humanity. The key was proper reverence and humility. Those who approached knowledge with respect, who studied diligently under proper guidance, who acknowledged Thoth as the source of wisdom and sought learning not for personal power but for the benefit of Ma'at, these people could access Thoth's gifts without danger. But those who sought knowledge for selfish reasons, who tried to seize power they had not earned, who approached the sacred mysteries with arrogance, these people would find that Thoth's knowledge could destroy as easily as it could enlighten. Thoth's role as the moon god was equally significant and intimately connected to his other attributes. In Egyptian thought, the sun and moon were both divine eyes, the sun being the eye of Ra and the moon being either the eye of Horus or the eye of Thoth, depending on the mythological context. The moon's regular cycles made it the perfect symbol for measurement and the passage of time, both of which were Thoth's province. Each phase of the moon, from new to full and back to new again, marked the passage of a lunar month, and the careful tracking of these cycles was essential for maintaining the religious calendar. The Egyptians had a complex relationship with time and calendars. For civil and administrative purposes, they used a solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days each, plus the 5 epigomenal days that Thoth had won from the moon. But for religious purposes, they used a lunar calendar, because the phases of the moon determined when certain festivals and rituals should be performed. Reconciling these two calendars required sophisticated astronomical observation and mathematical calculation, arts that fell under Thoth's domain. The moon's changing appearance in the sky became associated with several important myths involving Thoth. In one story, the moon was the eye of Horus, damaged in his battle with Set and then healed by Thoth. The waxing moon represented the eye's gradual healing, growing fuller and brighter until it reached perfect wholeness at the full moon. The waning moon showed the eye being damaged again in the eternal cycle of conflict between order and chaos, only to be healed once more by Thoth's magic and wisdom. In another tradition, the moon was Thoth's own eye, his watchful gaze that observed all that occurred in the darkness, when human eyes could not see. While Ra's sun illuminated the day and traveled through the underworld during the night, Thoth's moon watched over the night sky, ensuring that order was maintained even in darkness. This lunar oversight was particularly important because night was associated with danger, with chaos creeping at the edges of reality, and with the activities of hostile spirits and demons. Thoth's presence, symbolized by the moon, kept these threats at bay. The silver color of moonlight led to Thoth being called the Silver Aten, contrasting with the golden Aten of Ra's sun. Silver was associated with the moon throughout the ancient world, and in Egypt, it was sometimes considered more precious than gold precisely because of this lunar connection. Temples kept sacred silver for certain ritual purposes, and particularly holy statues were sometimes made of silver rather than the more common gold, honoring their connection to Thoth and the moon. Thoth's lunar nature also connected him to the measurement of time in a broader sense. He was the one who recorded the passage of days, months, and years. Each year was added to the annals that Thoth kept, the comprehensive record of all that had occurred since the beginning of time. In temple reliefs, Thoth is often shown holding a palm rib, the Egyptian symbol for year, writing down the regnal years of the pharaoh to preserve them for eternity. This act of recording time was not merely historical but deeply magical. By writing down the years, Thoth made them permanent and unchangeable, fixed in the cosmic record. The passing of years was visualized as marks on a palm rib, because palm trees produce a single new section of trunk each year, creating a natural calendar that the Egyptians used to track time. In Thoth's hands, this palm rib became a symbol of his mastery over time itself. He did not merely observe time passing. He measured it, recorded it, and in a sense created it through the act of measurement. Closely related to his role as measurer of time was Thoth's association with all forms of measurement and calculation. Mathematics was sacred knowledge, a gift from Thoth that allowed humans to understand and manipulate the world around them. The Egyptians were master mathematicians, capable of complex calculations needed for everything from pyramid construction to land surveying after the annual Nile flood. From calculating grain yields to determining the correct proportions for temple architecture, Egyptian mathematics was practical. rather than theoretical. They were less interested in abstract mathematical principles than in solving real-world problems. How much stone is needed for a pyramid? How much grain can be stored in this granary? What angle should the sides of a structure have for maximum stability? These were the questions Egyptian mathematics answered, and the scribes and engineers who did these calculations honored Thoth as the source of their ability. Geometry in particular was considered Thoth's special gift. The word geometry literally means earth measurement, and that's exactly what it was used for in Egypt. After the annual inundation of the Nile, which washed away field boundaries and landmarks, surveyors had to go out and re-establish property lines. They used ropes knotted at specific intervals to measure distances and angles, techniques that were probably developed as early as the Old Kingdom and remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. These rope stretchers, as they were called, worked under Thoth's patronage, and the accuracy of their measurements ensured the proper functioning of Egyptian agriculture and society. The most dramatic demonstration of Egyptian mathematical and geometrical skill was, of course, the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 BCE, demonstrates a level of precision that seems almost impossible given the tools available at the time. The base is level to within 2.1 centimeters over a distance of 230 meters. The sides are oriented to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of better than 1/15 of a degree. The angles and proportions incorporate mathematical relationships that may have been intentional or may have emerged naturally from the building methods, but either way demonstrates sophisticated understanding of geometry. All of this was possible because of mathematical knowledge that the Egyptians attributed to Thoth. Astronomy, the observation and recording of celestial phenomena, was another of Thoth's domains. The Egyptians were careful observers of the night sky. They identified constellations, tracked the movements of planets, predicted eclipses, and used the stars for practical purposes like navigation and timekeeping. The heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which we know as the Dog Star, coincided with the beginning of the Nile flood each year and was used to mark the start of the Egyptian New Year. This observation, and the calculations based on it, fell under Thoth's purview. Temple astronomers, working from platforms on temple roofs, tracked the movements of the stars and planets across the sky. They created star charts and astronomical texts that recorded their observations. They developed tables for predicting the positions of celestial bodies. All of this work was done in service to religion, for the movements of the heavens were understood as divine actions, and understanding them was a way of understanding the will of the gods. But it was also practical, providing the calendar information needed for agriculture and religious observances. Thoth's connection to mathematics and astronomy linked him to another important concept, that of divine order and proportion. The Egyptians believed that the universe was structured according to mathematical principles, that there was a correct proportion and relationship between all things. This mathematical order was an expression of Ma'at, the cosmic truth and justice that maintained reality. Thoth, as the master of mathematics, was therefore also a guardian of Ma'at, using his knowledge to keep the universe in proper balance. This brings us to another crucial aspect of Thoth's character, his role as the god of truth, justice, and law. While the goddess Ma'at personified truth and cosmic order, Thoth was her closest ally and often her partner in maintaining justice. He was the divine lawyer, the one who knew every law and precedent, who could argue any case with perfect logic and rhetoric. When disputes arose among the gods, Thoth was called upon to mediate. When questions of justice needed to be resolved, Thoth provided the wisdom to find the right answer. In the great law courts of the temples, judges invoked Thoth's name and sought his guidance. The legal systems of ancient Egypt, both civil and religious, operated under his patronage. To speak falsely in court was not just a crime against human society, but an offense against Thoth and Ma'at, a disruption of cosmic order. The oath sworn by parties in a legal case was sacred, and to break such an oath was to invite divine punishment. Thoth's reputation for fairness and impartiality made him the ideal judge. He was not swayed by personal feelings or loyalty to particular gods or humans. He judged based purely on truth and law, following the principles of Ma'at without deviation. This quality would become especially important in his role in the afterlife, as we shall see, but it pervaded all aspects of his character. Thoth was reliable, consistent, trustworthy. His judgment could be counted on to be correct, his records to be accurate, his words to be true. Magic, or Heka, was yet another domain where Thoth's power was supreme. In Egyptian thought, magic was not supernatural in the sense we usually mean. It was a natural force, part of the fundamental structure of reality. Heka was the power through which the gods created the world, the energy that made things happen, the force that could be directed through knowledge, ritual, and properly spoken words. Because Thoth knew the true names of all things, because he understood the deepest principles of how reality worked, he was the greatest magician among the gods. The true name of something was the key to power over it. Every entity, from the greatest god to the smallest creature, from the sun itself to a blade of grass, had a secret, true name. To know this name was to have power over that thing, to be able to command it or change it. This was the basis of Egyptian magic. Spells worked not through arbitrary supernatural force but through knowledge. A magician who knew the true name of a demon could command it. A doctor who knew the true name of a disease could heal it. A priest who knew the true names of the gods could invoke their power. Thoth knew all the names. He had spoken them at the beginning of time, calling each thing into being. He knew not only the names but the relationships between names, the grammatical and magical structures that governed how words and names could be combined to create effects. His knowledge was comprehensive, total, perfect, and he could share fragments of this knowledge with humans who approached him properly, who studied diligently, who maintained Ma'at. The medical arts were a form of magic, and they too fell under Thoth's patronage. Egyptian medicine was sophisticated for its time, combining practical treatments with magical rituals. Doctors knew how to set bones, treat wounds, perform surgeries, and prepare medications from herbs and minerals. But they also knew spells to drive out disease demons, incantations to speed healing, and rituals to protect against illness. All of this knowledge came from Thoth. Medical texts, like all texts, were sacred writings, and the most important medical manuscripts were attributed to Thoth himself. One famous medical document, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, is a remarkably rational surgical treatise that describes treatments for various injuries, particularly head wounds. It proceeds case by case, describing symptoms, providing a diagnosis, and prescribing treatment. What's remarkable is how little magic appears in this text. The treatments are practical, based on careful observation of what works. But even this rational document operates within Thoth's domain. For the knowledge it contains, the ability to observe, diagnose, and treat, all of this was understood as a gift from the god of wisdom. Other medical papyri, like the Ebers Papyrus, combine practical medicine with magical spells. A treatment might include both a pharmaceutical preparation, herbs ground up and mixed with honey or beer, and a spoken spell to drive out the demon causing the disease. Both aspects were necessary. The medicine worked on the physical level, the spell on the spiritual level. Together, they reflected Thoth's teaching that reality had multiple dimensions, and all must be addressed for healing to occur. In all of these roles, writing, wisdom, the moon, mathematics, astronomy, law, magic, medicine, and more, Thoth served as a link between the divine and human realms. He was accessible in a way some of the other great gods were not. Ra was too lofty, too powerful, too purely divine. Osiris was the king of the dead, associated with the afterlife. Set was too dangerous and chaotic. But Thoth, while fully divine, was also the great teacher, the one who took knowledge from the realm of the gods and shared it with humanity. He empowered humans to understand their world, to read and write, to calculate and measure, to heal and protect, to maintain Ma'at in their daily lives. This accessibility made Thoth beloved in a particular way. People didn't fear him as they feared some gods. They respected him, honored him, sought his blessing on their work. Scribes felt a personal connection to him. Doctors invoked his aid. Lawyers sought his guidance. Anyone who worked with knowledge in any form acknowledged Thoth as their patron and the source of their ability. And yet, for all this accessibility, Thoth remained mysterious. He was the god of secrets as well as the god of revealed knowledge. Not all that he knew was meant to be shared. Some knowledge was too powerful, too dangerous. The 42 books of Thoth contained truths that could destroy as well as enlighten. His wisdom included understanding of chaos as well as order, of darkness as well as light. He stood at boundaries and thresholds, comfortable with ambiguity, able to hold contradictions in balance. This threshold quality would become even more apparent in the myths that featured Thoth as a central character, particularly his role in the great conflicts and dramas of the gods. For Thoth was not merely a passive record-keeper or detached scholar. He actively participated in the most important events of Egyptian mythology, often serving as the mediator who resolved conflicts, the healer who repaired what was broken, the voice of reason that brought opposing sides to agreement. We turn now to those myths, beginning with the stories of creation and Thoth's role in shaping the cosmos. The ancient Egyptians did not have one single creation myth, but rather several, each associated with different theological centers and emphasizing different aspects of how the universe came to be. In all of these myths, however, certain themes recur: the emergence of order from chaos, the power of divine speech to create reality, the importance of the primordial waters, and the role of a creator god or gods who shaped the world. Thoth appeared in various ways across these different cosmologies, sometimes as a creator himself, sometimes as the voice or tongue of the creator, always as an essential element in the act of bringing forth ordered existence from primordial chaos. The most ancient of Egyptian creation traditions centered on Heliopolis, the city of the sun, where the great solar deity Ra-Atum was understood as the first creator. In this cosmology, in the beginning there was only none, the infinite primordial waters, dark and undifferentiated, containing within itself the potential for all existence but with no actual existence yet manifest. From these waters, by an act of will, Ra-Atum emerged. He was both Ra, the sun, the source of light and life, and Atum, the completed one, the all, the totality of existence concentrated into a single divine being. Ra-Atum stood upon the primordial mound, the first solid ground to emerge from the waters, and began the work of creation. In some versions of the myth, he created by masturbation or spitting, producing the first divine couple, Shu, the air, and Tefnut, moisture. These two in turn produced Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, and from them came the gods of the Ennead, the 9 great deities of Heliopolis: Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Horus the Elder, along with their parents and grandparents. This creation through generation, one divine couple producing the next, established the initial structure of the cosmos. In this Heliopolitan cosmology, Thoth appeared not as one of the original creators but as the tongue of Ra, the voice through which the sun god spoke creation into being. While Ra-Atum was the willpower behind creation, Thoth was the articulating voice that gave form to that will. This is a crucial distinction. Ra decided what should exist, Thoth named it and thus brought it into actual being. The idea and the word, thought and speech, will and expression, working together to create reality. This role as the tongue of Ra emphasized several important aspects of Thoth's nature. First, it showed his intimate relationship with the supreme creator god. Thoth was not separate from or subordinate to Ra in a simple hierarchical sense. Rather, he was part of Ra, the articulating principle made manifest as a distinct deity. Second, it emphasized the power of the spoken word in Egyptian cosmology. Creation occurred through speech. What was spoken came into being. The universe was literally called into existence by divine utterance, and Thoth was that utterance personified. In later theological developments, particularly during the Middle Kingdom and later, this concept was refined further. Texts from this period sometimes describe creation as occurring when Ra conceived of things in his heart and Thoth spoke them into existence. Heart and tongue, thought and speech, working in harmony. The heart was understood as the seat of thought and consciousness in Egyptian anthropology. The modern notion of the brain as the organ of thinking would have seemed strange to them. Thought occurred in the heart, and then the tongue expressed that thought in words. Ra was the cosmic heart, Thoth the cosmic tongue, and their partnership produced all of creation. But while the Heliopolitan creation myth was perhaps the most widely known, it was not the only one. At Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt and the cult center of the god Ptah, a different creation tradition developed that gave an even more prominent role to the power of divine speech, and thus to Thoth's creative function. The Memphite theology, preserved most completely in the Shabaka stone, a 25th dynasty copy of a much older text, presented Ptah as the supreme creator. But Ptah's method of creation was even more explicitly intellectual and verbal than Ra-Atum's. According to the Memphite doctrine, Ptah created by conceiving of things in his heart and then speaking them into existence through his tongue. The text makes this explicit. Every divine word came into existence through what the heart thought and the tongue commanded. In this cosmology, thought and speech were not merely tools of creation but the very essence of it. Reality itself was essentially linguistic, structured according to the principles of language and meaning. And while the Memphite texts emphasize Ptah as the creator, they also acknowledge that this creative speech was enacted through the gods who represented these principles. The heart was Horus, and the tongue was Thoth. Here we see Thoth's role as the spokesman of the creator elevated to a cosmic principle. He was not just the tongue of Ra, but the tongue of creation itself, the principle of articulation through which thought becomes reality. This Memphite theology had profound implications. It suggested that language and thought were not human inventions but cosmic realities, patterns woven into the fabric of existence itself. To speak, to think, to write, these were not merely practical activities but participation in the ongoing work of creation. Every act of naming, every sentence spoken or written, echoed in some small way the original creative act through which Thoth brought the world into being. But perhaps nowhere was Thoth's creative role more prominent than in the cosmology of Hermopolis, his own cult city. The Hermopolitan creation myth centered on the Ogdoad, the 8 primordial deities who existed before creation. These 8 gods represented the formless qualities of the pre-creation state: Nun and Nornet, the primordial waters; He and Hauhet, infinity; Kek and Kauket, darkness; and Amun and Amonet, hiddenness. They were not individual personalities, but rather personifications of the chaotic qualities that characterized existence before order was established. From the interaction of these 8 primordial forces, according to the Hermopolitan tradition, the primordial mound emerged from the waters of Nun. On this mound, or in some versions from a cosmic egg laid upon it, the creator came into being, and that creator in the Hermopolitan theology was Thoth himself. As the demiurge of Hermopolis, according to this local theological tradition, Thoth emerged from the primordial chaos and immediately began the work of imposing order upon it. He did this through speech, through naming, through the application of intellectual principles to raw, undifferentiated potential. Thoth spoke, and his words structured reality. He named the elements, the directions, the forces of nature, and in naming them, he separated them from the chaos and gave them distinct existence. This interpretation of Thoth as the primary creator emphasized his role as the principle of order and rationality. Before Thoth's creative act, there was only chaos, formless and indefinite. After Thoth, there was cosmos, ordered and structured, governed by law and proportion. His creative act was essentially an intellectual one, the application of categories and names to chaos, the imposition of structure through knowledge and language. The Hermopolitan theology also associated Thoth with the ibis bird in a creative role. According to one variant of the myth, the great cosmic egg that contained the creator was laid by the primordial goose, and when it hatched, out came not Ra but Thoth in the form of an ibis. In another version, Thoth himself as an ibis laid the cosmic egg from which the sun was born. These variations, which might seem contradictory to modern readers, actually complemented each other in Egyptian religious thought. They were different ways of expressing the same essential truth, that intelligence and articulation were necessary for creation, that the word preceded and produced the light, that thought and speech were the tools through which chaos became cosmos. What all these creation myths shared, whether from Heliopolis, Memphis, or Hermopolis, was the understanding that creation was not a single completed event, but an ongoing process. The universe constantly needed to be maintained and renewed. Each day, Ra's sun had to be reborn from the underworld. Each year, the Nile had to flood and Egypt had to be renewed. Each moment, the forces of chaos pressed against the boundaries of order, threatening to dissolve reality back into the primordial waters of Nun. This constant threat meant that creation was never finished. It had to be continuously reaffirmed, continuously defended, continuously remade, and Thoth played a crucial role in this ongoing maintenance of creation. As the moon, he measured time and marked its passage, ensuring that the cycles of nature continued in their proper rhythm. As the recorder of divine decrees, he preserved the laws that governed reality, preventing them from being forgotten or corrupted. As the master of magic and the true names, he could repair what was broken and restore what was damaged. He was not just a creator at the beginning of time, but a sustainer throughout all time, constantly working to maintain Ma'at, the order and truth that kept the universe in existence. This maintenance role connected directly to one of the most important concepts in Egyptian thought, Ma'at. This word is difficult to translate into English because it encompasses several related ideas: truth, justice, order, balance, harmony, proper proportion. Ma'at was both a principle and a goddess, both an abstract ideal and a living reality. It was the proper order of things, the way the universe should be, the balance between opposing forces that allowed existence to continue. Without Ma'at, the universe would collapse back into chaos. The sun would not rise, the Nile would not flood, the crops would not grow, society would dissolve into anarchy, and eventually, all would return to the undifferentiated waters of none. Maintaining Ma'at was therefore the most important task of both gods and humans. Every proper action, every truth spoken, every law upheld, every ritual correctly performed, contributed to maintaining Ma'at. Every lie, every crime, every violation of proper order diminished Ma'at and strengthened the forces of chaos. Thoth was one of the primary guardians of Ma'at. His association with truth, with accurate record-keeping, with wise judgment, with the precise knowledge that allowed proper action, all of this made him essential to maintaining cosmic order. The goddess Ma'at herself was sometimes described as Thoth's daughter or wife or sister, these kinship terms being fluid in Egyptian mythology and serving more to express relationship than literal genealogy. What mattered was that Thoth and Ma'at worked together, his wisdom supporting her order, her truth expressed through his words. In temple rituals, the king or his priestly representatives offered Ma'at to the gods, literally presenting a small figure of the goddess Ma'at, often with Thoth's oversight. This ritual act symbolized the maintenance of cosmic order, the human participation in the ongoing work of creation. The king, as the earthly representative of divine order, had to uphold Ma'at in the human realm. The gods, particularly Ra and Thoth, maintained Ma'at in the divine realm, and the balance between these levels of reality kept the universe in existence. Thoth's role in creation and in maintaining order naturally led to his involvement in the great conflicts of the gods. For while the gods worked together to maintain Ma'at, they also sometimes came into conflict with each other. Divine passions, ambitions, and rivalries could threaten to tear apart the very fabric of reality. When such conflicts arose, someone had to mediate, to find solutions, to restore balance. That someone was often Thoth. The most important of these divine conflicts, and the one in which Thoth played the most crucial role, was the eternal struggle between Horus and Set, between order and chaos, between the legitimate heir and the usurping rebel. This conflict stood at the heart of Egyptian mythology and touched upon the most fundamental questions of kingship, inheritance, justice, and the nature of reality itself. And it was Thoth, more than any other god, who resolved this conflict and brought about its eventual settlement. But before we can understand Thoth's role in the conflict between Horus and Set, we must first understand the events that led to this great divine battle. We must know the story of Osiris, the perfect king whose murder set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of heaven and earth. Osiris was a god of many aspects: king of the gods, lord of vegetation, god of the dead, symbol of resurrection. But in the mythology of the Osiris cycle, he appeared first and foremost as the ideal king, ruling Egypt in a golden age when the land prospered and all lived in harmony. Osiris brought civilization to Egypt. He taught humans agriculture, giving them the knowledge of how to cultivate grains and make bread and beer. He established laws and proper religious worship. Under his rule, Egypt flourished in peace and abundance. But Osiris had a brother, Set, the god of storms and chaos, of the desert and foreign lands. Set was ambitious and jealous. He coveted the throne that Osiris held, and he plotted to take it for himself. Different versions of the myth tell the story in different ways, but the essential elements remain the same. Set trapped Osiris, killed him, and usurped his throne. In the most famous version of the myth, Set built a beautiful chest, perfectly sized to Osiris's measurements. At a great feast, Set offered this chest as a gift to whomever it would fit. When Osiris lay down in it, finding it a perfect match, Set and his co-conspirators slammed the lid shut, sealed it, and threw it into the Nile. Osiris drowned, and his body was carried away by the river's current. Isis, the wife of Osiris, and one of the most powerful goddesses in the Egyptian pantheon, set out to find her husband's body. She searched throughout Egypt and eventually found the chest lodged in a tree in the Syrian city of Byblos. Through cleverness and magic, she retrieved the body and brought it back to Egypt. But Set discovered what she had done. Enraged, he seized the body of Osiris, tore it into 14 pieces, and scattered them throughout Egypt, so that Isis could never reassemble her husband. Isis, aided by her sister Nephthys and by Anubis, the god of embalming, set out once more. Traveling the length and breadth of Egypt, she recovered all the pieces of Osiris's body save one, his phallus, which had been eaten by a fish. Using magic and the newly invented art of mummification, Isis and Anubis reassembled Osiris's body. Then Isis, through powerful magic, temporarily restored Osiris to life and conceived a child with him, Horus, who would one day avenge his father and reclaim the throne. Osiris, however, could not remain among the living. He had died and been resurrected. But his resurrection was not a return to his former life. Instead, he became the king of the dead, ruler of the underworld, the lord of Duat. His death and resurrection made him the perfect lord of the afterlife. Every Egyptian who died underwent what Osiris had undergone, and every Egyptian hoped to be resurrected as Osiris had been resurrected. The phrase "the Osiris name" became the standard way to refer to the deceased, indicating that in death, every person became identified with Osiris, participated in his death and rebirth. But while Osiris took his place as king of the dead, Set ruled the living world. He had seized the throne through murder and treachery, and he held it through force. This was a violation of Ma'at on the deepest level. Set's rule was illegitimate, but he was too powerful to be overthrown easily, and so matters stood for many years. Meanwhile, Isis raised her son Horus in secret, in the marshes of the Nile Delta, hiding him from Set's wrath. When Horus came of age, strong and skilled in both arms and magic, he emerged to challenge Set for the throne of Egypt. What followed was an 80-year battle between the two gods, a conflict that ranged across Egypt and into the heavens, a struggle that involved not just physical combat but magical duels, legal arguments, and political maneuvering among the gods. And it was here that Thoth stepped into the central role, for this conflict between Horus and Set could not be resolved through strength alone. It required wisdom, judgment, and above all, the restoration of Ma'at that Set's murder of Osiris had violated. The conflict between Horus and Set is recorded in several ancient Egyptian texts, but the most complete version appears in a document known as the Contendings of Horus and Seth, a papyrus from the 20th dynasty that presents the story in a way that is sometimes serious, sometimes almost satirical, but always deeply concerned with questions of legitimacy, justice, and proper order. The gods gathered in council to decide who should rule Egypt. On one side stood Horus, son of Osiris, the legitimate heir who claimed the throne by right of inheritance. On the other side stood Set, who had held the throne for 80 years and argued that he should keep it by right of possession and superior strength. The gods were divided. Some supported Horus's claim based on hereditary right. Others supported Set, arguing that only his strength was sufficient to defend Egypt against the forces of chaos, particularly the serpent Apophis who threatened to swallow the sun each night. Ra, as the head of the divine council, presided over the proceedings. But even Ra was conflicted. He recognized Horus's legitimate claim, but he also valued Set's strength and felt some personal affinity with the god of chaos. The debate went on for years with no resolution. Various gods spoke in favor of one claimant or the other. Challenges were issued and met. Contests were devised to prove who was worthier. Throughout all of this, Thoth served as the voice of law and reason. He was not the head of the council, that role belonged to Ra, but he was its legal expert, its record keeper, its wise counselor. When arguments became too heated, Thoth would intervene with calm logic. When precedents needed to be cited, Thoth knew them all. When the proceedings needed to be recorded, Thoth wrote everything down with perfect accuracy. He did not advocate passionately for either side, but rather sought to guide the council toward a just resolution. Thoth's position in this conflict was particularly interesting because it revealed his character so clearly. He could have sided with the stronger party, with Set, and thus aligned himself with power. Or he could have sided with the rightful heir, with Horus, and thus aligned himself with tradition and legitimacy. But Thoth did neither. Instead, he stood for Ma'at itself, for truth and justice regardless of personal loyalty or political calculation. His allegiance was to principle, not to personality. As the proceedings continued, Horus and Set engaged in various contests to prove their worthiness. They transformed themselves into hippopotamuses and dove deep into the Nile, agreeing that whoever could hold his breath longer underwater would win the throne. Isis, watching from the shore and fearing for her son, threw a harpoon into the water, trying to strike Set, but she hit Horus instead. She threw again and this time struck Set, but when he cried out that she was harming her own brother, she felt pity and pulled the harpoon out. Horus, enraged at his mother's compassion for his enemy, emerged from the water and cut off her head in his fury. Ra was so angry at this that he declared Horus should be punished, and the gods searched for him. Set found Horus asleep on a mountain, seized him, tore out his eyes, and buried them on the mountain where they grew into lotus flowers. Horus was left blind and helpless. According to different versions of the myth, the restoration came from different sources. Some traditions credit the goddess Hathor, who found the wounded god and healed his eyes with gazelle milk, restoring his sight. Other accounts attribute this healing to Thoth, emphasizing his role as the divine physician and restorer of wholeness. What mattered most was that Horus was restored, made whole again, able to continue his quest for the throne. The Eye of Horus, the Wadjet Eye, became one of the most powerful symbols in Egyptian culture, precisely because of this myth. The eye that was damaged and then restored represented wholeness recovered, health regained, the restoration of Ma'at after it had been violated. It became a protective amulet, worn by the living and placed in tombs with the dead. Scholars have noted that in some traditions where Thoth healed the Eye of Horus, this restoration was understood through mathematical symbolism. Different parts of the eye symbol came to represent specific fractions: 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, and 1/64. Together, these fractions add up to 63/64, with the missing 1/64 sometimes interpreted as representing the magical element that Thoth added to make the eye whole, the divine spark beyond pure calculation. This mathematical restoration of the Eye of Horus exemplified Thoth's approach to healing and restoration. He used precise knowledge, careful measurement, and mathematical accuracy, but he also recognized that pure mathematics was not enough. The final small fraction required magic, required the application of hidden knowledge, required that spark of divine power that transcended mere calculation. Thoth embodied both reason and magic, both science and mystery, both the quantifiable and the ineffable. The contests between Horus and Set continued. In one they raced in boats, but Set cheated by making his boat of stone painted to look like wood, hoping it would be faster. Instead it sank. In another contest, they fought as hippopotamuses. In yet another, they engaged in a homosexual encounter initiated by Set, who hoped to humiliate Horus by penetrating him, but Horus through cleverness turned the tables and humiliated Set instead. These stories, which strike modern readers as strange or even crude, served important functions in Egyptian thought. They demonstrated that Set, for all his strength, was also foolish and could be outwitted. They showed that Horus, though younger, had the cunning necessary to rule, and they illustrated that legitimacy came not from power alone but from wisdom, from Ma'at, from right order. Throughout all these contests and conflicts, the gods remained divided. Finally, the divine council decided to write to Osiris in the underworld and ask his opinion. Who should rule? Osiris responded with righteous anger. His son was the legitimate heir. The throne belonged to Horus by right of birth and by Ma'at. Moreover, Osiris reminded the gods that he controlled the messengers of death and could send them to bring any god to the underworld if his judgment was not heeded. Even the gods could die, and Osiris ruled the realm of death. This letter from Osiris shifted the balance. One by one, the gods acknowledged that Horus's claim was just. Even Ra, who had favored Set, agreed. Set was forced to concede defeat, though in some versions of the myth he continued to contest the decision and had to be physically subdued by the other gods. And who recorded this final decision? Who wrote down the verdict that Horus should rule? Who announced the judgment to all of heaven and earth? Thoth, of course. He recorded the decision in his annals, making it permanent and unchangeable. He announced it to all the gods. And most importantly, he performed the ceremony that placed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt upon Horus's head, legitimizing his rule and restoring Ma'at to the cosmos. In this role, Thoth was not merely a record keeper or announcer, but an active agent in the restoration of right order. His declaration mattered. His written record made the decision real in a way that the gods' agreement alone could not. This demonstrates the Egyptian understanding of the power of writing and of Thoth's words. To write something down, to officially record it, was to make it true in a deeper sense, to fix it in the structure of reality itself. But Thoth's involvement in the contendings of Horus and Set went beyond record-keeping. Throughout the long conflict, he had served as mediator, voice of reason, and guardian of justice. He had ensured that both sides received fair hearing. He had prevented the conflict from destroying the fabric of reality. He had guided the gods toward a just resolution, and in the end, his wisdom had triumphed. Ma'at was restored, the rightful king took the throne, and order prevailed over chaos. Yet Set was not destroyed or banished completely. In recognition of his strength and his role in defending Ra from Apophis, Set was given a place in the sun god's barque, the boat that carried Ra across the sky each day. Set's chaotic power was thus channeled into cosmic defense rather than destructive rebellion. Order and chaos were brought into balance, not through the elimination of one by the other, but through their proper relationship under the governance of Ma'at. This balance, this holding of opposites in tension without allowing either to overwhelm the other, was perhaps Thoth's greatest achievement in the Contendings. He had not simply helped one side defeat the other. He had found a way to incorporate both into a larger harmony. This myth had profound implications for Egyptian society and government. It established the principle that kingship passed from father to son, that hereditary right was more important than mere strength. It showed that even the gods were subject to law and justice. It demonstrated that conflicts could and should be resolved through debate, judgment, and appeal to principle rather than through violence alone. And it positioned Thoth as the guarantor of this system, the god who ensured that law would be followed, that truth would prevail, that Ma'at would be maintained. In every subsequent coronation of an Egyptian pharaoh, in every divine birth and legitimization ritual, the myth of Horus's rightful inheritance and his vindication over Set was reenacted, and in those rituals, Thoth's role was crucial. He was the one who placed the crown, who declared the legitimacy of the king, whose words made the pharaoh truly king. Without Thoth's proclamation, without his written record, kingship was not fully established. This brings us naturally to another of Thoth's most important roles, his function as the divine scribe and judge, particularly in the context of death and the afterlife. For if Thoth recorded the rightful succession of kings among the living, he also recorded the deeds and words of all beings, preserving them for the final judgment that awaited every soul after death. The ancient Egyptians had complex and evolving beliefs about death and the afterlife. Death was not the end, but rather a transition, a dangerous journey from this world to the next. The deceased had to navigate through the underworld, avoid various perils, pass through gates guarded by fearsome beings, answer questions correctly, and eventually reach the Hall of Two Truths, where their heart would be weighed to determine whether they were worthy of eternal life in the blessed fields of Aru, or whether they would be devoured and cease to exist. At every stage of this journey, Thoth played a crucial role. He was the guide who knew all the paths through the underworld. He was the magician whose spells protected the deceased. He was the advocate who spoke on behalf of those who had lived justly. And ultimately, he was the scribe who recorded the result of the final judgment, the one whose written verdict determined the eternal fate of every soul. The journey to the afterlife began at the moment of death, when the Ka, the life force, separated from the body. The Ba, the personality or soul, would emerge as well, often depicted as a human-headed bird that could fly between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But the Ak, the transfigured spirit that would eventually reach the afterlife, had to be created through proper funerary rituals, and through the deceased's successful navigation of the underworld. Before any of this could happen, the body had to be preserved. The Egyptians developed the art of mummification specifically to maintain the physical form, for they believed that the soul needed a body to return to, a physical anchor in the world. The process of mummification was elaborate and expensive, involving the removal of internal organs, the desiccation of the body with natron salt, the wrapping in linen bandages, and the application of various resins and oils. Throughout this process, priests recited spells and performed rituals that called upon the protection of various gods, and Thoth was prominent among them. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed on the mummy before it was sealed in its tomb, was particularly important. This ritual symbolically restored to the deceased the ability to breathe, speak, eat, drink, and use their senses in the afterlife. It involved touching various parts of the mummy with special ritual implements while reciting specific spells. Thoth's wisdom and magic were invoked to ensure the effectiveness of these rituals. Once the body was prepared and the tomb sealed, the real journey began. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching. The deceased's ba had to travel through the duat, the underworld, a realm of darkness and danger. Fortunately, the deceased was not unarmed. They had been buried with the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, passwords, and instructions for navigating the afterlife. These texts were often written on papyrus scrolls placed in the tomb, or painted on the walls of the burial chamber, or inscribed on the coffin itself. The Book of the Dead was not a single unified text, but rather a compilation of spells drawn from a much larger body of funerary literature. Different versions contain different selections of spells depending on the wealth of the deceased and the preferences of the priests who prepared the burial. But all versions were attributed to Thoth. He was said to have written these spells, to have composed them with his perfect knowledge of the underworld and its perils. To use these spells was to speak with Thoth's authority, to invoke his power, to benefit from his wisdom. The spells served many functions. Some protected against serpents, scorpions, and other dangerous creatures. Some gave the deceased the power to transform into various creatures. A golden falcon to fly over obstacles, a lotus flower to emerge pure from the waters, a phoenix to be reborn. Some provided passwords to get past guardians and through locked doors. Some restored the deceased's memory so they would not forget their name or identity. And some, crucially, provided the words that needed to be spoken at the final judgment. That final judgment took place in the Hall of Two Truths, a great chamber where Osiris sat in judgment, attended by 42 divine judges and by other gods, including Anubis and Thoth. The deceased would enter this hall and make what is known as the negative confession, a declaration that they had not committed various sins. I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not cheated, I have not caused suffering. The list went on for 42 declarations, one addressed to each of the divine judges. Then came the crucial moment, the weighing of the heart. The deceased's heart, considered the seat of consciousness and morality, was placed on one side of a great scale. On the other side was placed a feather, the symbol of Ma'at, representing truth and justice. If the heart was as light as the feather, if it was not weighed down by sin and evil, then the deceased was judged worthy. If the heart was heavier than the feather, if sin had made it heavy, then the deceased was condemned. And who recorded this weighing? Who stood beside the scale with palette and pen, carefully noting the result? Thoth. He watched with his keen eyes as the scale balanced or tipped. He recorded the exact weight of the heart. He announced the verdict, and he wrote it in his annals, the permanent record that could never be changed. In depictions of the weighing of the heart scene, which appear in countless tombs and papyri, Thoth is always present. Usually, he is shown in his ibis-headed form, standing or squatting beside the scale, his writing palette in one hand, his reed pen in the other. He is poised to record, his attention focused on the balance, waiting to see which way it will tip. Sometimes he is shown actually touching the scale, not to manipulate it, but to measure it more carefully, to ensure perfect accuracy. Nearby stands Amit, the devourer, a composite monster with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. If the heart failed the test, if it was heavy with sin, Amit would devour it, and the deceased would suffer the second death, the final death, complete annihilation with no possibility of resurrection or afterlife. This was the fate the Egyptians feared most, not painful punishment but complete non-existence. But if the heart passed the test, if it balanced perfectly with the feather, then Thoth would announce Ma Cheru, which means true of voice or justified. This declaration, spoken by Thoth and recorded by his pen, transformed the deceased from a mere dead person into a blessed spirit, an Ach, worthy of eternal life. The justified soul would then be led before Osiris, who would welcome them and grant them access to the field of reeds, the paradise where they would live forever in peace and plenty. Thoth's role in this judgment was absolutely crucial. He was not the judge. That role belonged to Osiris and the 42 assessors. But he was the recorder, and in being the recorder, he was in some sense the one who made the judgment official and binding. His written word created the reality of the judgment. When he declared someone true of voice, they became true of voice. When he recorded someone's heart as balanced, it was balanced. His authority in this matter was absolute, because it was based not on personal power but on his perfect knowledge and his perfect truthfulness. Thoth could not be bribed, could not be fooled, could not be persuaded to record a false result. He saw truth and recorded truth, and that was that. This role gave Thoth a unique position in the Egyptian afterlife. He was not the fearsome judge like Osiris, nor the guide of the dead like Anubis, nor the devourer like Ammit. He was the impartial witness, the accurate recorder, the voice that announced the verdict. In this role, he gave hope to the righteous and certainty to all. If you had lived according to Ma'at, if your heart was truly light, then Thoth would announce your justification. His word could be trusted completely. The Book of the Dead contained spells that called upon Thoth's aid throughout the judgment process. One spell asked Thoth to serve as the deceased's advocate, to speak on their behalf before Osiris. Let not my name stink before the council. Let not lies be spoken against me. May I be true of voice through Thoth. Another spell called upon Thoth to protect the deceased's heart, so that it would not testify against them. O my heart, do not rise up against me as a witness. Do not oppose me in the council. Do not rebel against me before the keeper of the balance. These spells reflect a fascinating tension in Egyptian thought about the afterlife. On one hand, judgment was supposed to be absolutely fair, based purely on the deceased's actual conduct in life. On the other hand, the proper use of magical spells and divine intercession could help ensure a favorable outcome. This was not seen as cheating, but rather as making proper use of the knowledge Thoth himself had provided. The spells in the Book of the Dead were Thoth's gift to humanity, tools to help the deceased navigate the dangers of the afterlife. Using them properly was itself a demonstration of wisdom and righteousness. Moreover, the spells often worked not by changing reality, but by changing the deceased's knowledge of reality. A spell might not actually make the heart lighter, but might help the deceased remember and articulate their true righteousness. It might not change Thoth's judgment, but might ensure that the deceased presented themselves in the best possible light, spoke the correct words, demonstrated their knowledge of divine truth. In this sense, the magic of the Book of the Dead was the magic of proper knowledge and proper speech, both of which were Thoth's primary gifts. Thoth's function as scribe and judge extended beyond individual souls to encompass all of reality. He kept the annals of the gods, recording every decree, every deed, every significant event. He maintained the cosmic memory, ensuring that nothing was forgotten, that all had consequences, that Ma'at prevailed not just in the moment but across all time. This function made him in some sense the conscience of the universe, the witness who could not be escaped, whose records could not be altered. This brings us to consider Thoth's relationships with the other gods, for no deity existed in isolation. The Egyptian pantheon was a complex web of relationships, kinships, alliances, and associations. Thoth's position in this web reveals much about his nature and his importance in Egyptian religious thought. Thoth's relationship with Ra, the sun god, was one of the most important in the pantheon. As we have seen, Thoth was sometimes described as the tongue of Ra, the voice through which the Creator spoke, but their relationship went deeper than that. Ra, as the supreme solar deity, represented power, light, and the visible aspect of divinity. Thoth, as the lunar deity, represented knowledge, the hidden, and the intellectual aspect of divinity. Together they embodied a complete cosmology, power and wisdom, light and reflection, day and night. In the daily cycle of the sun, Thoth played a crucial supporting role. Each day, Ra traveled across the sky in his solar barque, bringing light and life to Egypt. Each night, he descended into the underworld and made a perilous journey through the hours of darkness, where he faced countless dangers, including the great serpent Apophis, who sought to swallow him and end creation. During this night journey, various gods accompanied and protected Ra, and Thoth was prominent among them. Thoth's role in the night journey was primarily as the spokesman and magician who could defeat enemies through words and knowledge rather than violence. When Apophis attacked, Set would fight the serpent with spear and strength, but Thoth would fight it with magic, speaking spells that paralyzed the serpent, pronouncing its true name to gain power over it, using his knowledge of the underworld to predict and counter its attacks. Together, Set's strength and Thoth's wisdom kept Ra safe through the dangerous night. At dawn, when Ra emerged from the underworld and rose again in the eastern sky, Thoth was there to greet him. The baboons who chattered at sunrise were understood as manifestations or servants of Thoth, welcoming the sun god and celebrating his successful passage through the night. This association linked Thoth intimately with the daily renewal of creation, with the moment when light conquered darkness and the world was reborn. Thoth's relationship with Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice, was equally significant. In some traditions, Ma'at was called Thoth's wife or sister or daughter, these kinship terms being ways of expressing their intimate connection rather than literal family relationships. What mattered was that Thoth and Ma'at worked together to maintain cosmic order. Ma'at embodied the principle of truth, the ideal state of proper order. Thoth applied that principle through judgment, record-keeping, and the application of divine law. In the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart was weighed, both Thoth and Ma'at were present. Ma'at appeared both as the feather on the scale and sometimes as a goddess standing nearby, her feather marking the standard against which the heart was measured. Thoth recorded the result. Together, they ensured that truth prevailed, that justice was done, that every soul received exactly what their conduct in life had earned. This partnership between Thoth and Ma'at reflected a fundamental Egyptian belief that truth and knowledge were inseparable. You could not truly know something unless it was true. False knowledge was not knowledge at all, but ignorance in disguise. Thoth's wisdom was reliable precisely because it was based on truth. He could not be mistaken because he knew things as they truly were. And Ma'at's truth was meaningful precisely because it could be known, because Thoth had articulated it, written it down, made it accessible. Thoth's relationship with Seshat, the goddess of writing, provides an interesting insight into Egyptian thought about gender and divinity. Seshat was sometimes called Thoth's wife, sometimes his daughter, sometimes his female counterpart or aspect. She was the goddess of writing, record-keeping, mathematics, and architecture, domains that overlapped significantly with Thoth's own. In temple reliefs, she appeared as a woman wearing a seven-pointed star or plant on her head, holding a palm rib for recording years, and wearing a leopard skin garment associated with ritual purity. While Thoth was the god of writing in general, Seshat had specific associations with architectural plans and with the ritual of stretching the cord, the ceremony performed before building a temple, in which the dimensions and orientation of the building were carefully measured and marked. This ritual linked writing, mathematics, and sacred architecture, all domains where precise knowledge and accurate recording were essential. The relationship between Thoth and Seshat illustrates how the Egyptians understood divine power as existing in both male and female forms. Important concepts often had both a male and female deity associated with them, not as competitors but as complements. Thoth and Seshat together embodied the full range of what writing and knowledge meant. They worked together in perfect harmony, and humans benefited from both. Thoth's relationship with Anubis, the god of embalming and protector of the dead, was also significant. Both gods played important roles in the afterlife, but their functions differed. Anubis was primarily concerned with the physical preparation of the body and the guiding of the deceased through the initial stages of the underworld journey. He was the one who performed the mummification, who conducted the opening of the mouth ceremony, who led the deceased to the Hall of Two Truths. Thoth, in contrast, was concerned with the intellectual and judicial aspects of death. He provided the knowledge needed to navigate the afterlife through the spells of the Book of the Dead. He conducted the weighing of the heart and recorded the verdict. Where Anubis was the practical guide and caretaker, Thoth was the wise counselor and judge. In depictions of the weighing of the heart, both gods often appeared. Anubis would be shown adjusting the scale, ensuring it was perfectly balanced, carefully placing the heart and the feather. Thoth would be standing nearby with his writing palette, ready to record the result. Sometimes Anubis would even be shown looking toward Thoth, as if checking that Thoth was ready to record before allowing the weighing to proceed. This cooperation between the two gods ensured that the judgment was both practically and legally sound, both carefully conducted and accurately recorded. Thoth's relationship with Horus deserves special attention given his role in the Contendings, and in healing Horus's eye. Thoth served as Horus's advocate, counselor, and healer, helping the young god reclaim his rightful throne. But this was not simple favoritism. Thoth supported Horus not because of personal affection, but because Horus's claim was just according to Ma'at. Had Set's claim been the just one, Thoth would have supported Set. What mattered to Thoth was not who won, but that the right principle prevailed. After Horus became king, Thoth continued to serve an important function in relation to royal power. The pharaoh was understood as the earthly manifestation of Horus, the living god who ruled Egypt. But the pharaoh's power was not absolute or arbitrary. It had to be exercised in accordance with Ma'at, and Thoth was the god who ensured this. The pharaoh's decrees were recorded by scribes who served under Thoth's patronage. The laws by which the pharaoh ruled were under Thoth's oversight. The wisdom with which the pharaoh governed was a gift from Thoth. This relationship positioned Thoth as a kind of check on royal power. Even the god-king pharaoh was subject to Ma'at, to truth and justice, and Thoth was the guardian of these principles. A pharaoh who ruled unjustly, who violated Ma'at, could not count on Thoth's support. This gave the Egyptian priesthood, particularly the priests of Thoth, a certain moral authority. They were the ones who preserved and interpreted the laws, who maintained the records, who taught scribes and advised kings. Their authority came not from military power but from knowledge and their connection to Thoth. Thoth's relationship with Isis, the great goddess of magic, provides another interesting case study. Isis was famous for her magical power, which she used to protect her son Horus, to resurrect Osiris, and to accomplish various other mighty deeds. But where did Isis learn her magic? According to some myths, she learned it from Thoth. Or more accurately, Thoth's knowledge was the foundation on which Isis built her particular style of practical, results-oriented magic. The story is told that Isis, seeking ultimate magical power, tricked Ra into revealing his true name. She created a serpent that bit Ra, causing him terrible pain. She offered to heal him but demanded to know his secret name as payment. Ra, in his agony, finally revealed it, and Isis gained power even over the king of the gods. This story positions Isis as perhaps more powerful than Thoth in terms of raw magical ability. But it also shows her using the principle that Thoth embodied, that true names contain power, that knowledge is the key to magical effectiveness. Thoth and Isis represented two approaches to knowledge and magic. Thoth was the systematic scholar, the one who understood principles and maintained comprehensive knowledge. Isis was the practical magician, the one who applied knowledge to solve specific problems. Both were necessary. Thoth provided the foundation of wisdom. Isis showed how that wisdom could be used in the world. Thoth's relationships with various other deities could be explored at length. He was associated with Shu, the god of air, in contexts involving speech and breath. He had connections to Ptah through their shared creative roles in different cosmologies. He was paired with various goddesses in different cult centers, these pairings serving local theological purposes while not necessarily contradicting his other relationships. The Egyptian pantheon was flexible enough to accommodate multiple, sometimes seemingly contradictory relationships, all of which served to express different aspects of divine reality. What all these relationships had in common was that they positioned Thoth as essential but not dominating. He was not the king of the gods like Ra or Osiris. He did not have the raw power of Set or the passionate intensity of Isis, but he was the one they all needed. Without Thoth's wisdom, Ra's power would be undirected. Without Thoth's justice, Horus's rule would be illegitimate. Without Thoth's records, Ma'at could not be maintained. Without Thoth's magic, even Isis's practical sorcery would lack its theoretical foundation. This brings us naturally to consideration of how Thoth was actually worshipped in ancient Egypt, how his cult was organized, where his temples stood, and how ordinary Egyptians related to this god of wisdom and writing. The center of Thoth's worship was always Hermopolis Magna in Middle Egypt, the city the Egyptians called Kmun. This was his primary cult center, the place where his worship was most elaborate and where the theological traditions most closely associated with him were developed and preserved. But Thoth was honored throughout Egypt. Every temple had a library and scriptorium under his protection. Every school where scribes learned their craft was essentially a shrine to Thoth, and individual devotion to Thoth was widespread among literate Egyptians. At Hermopolis, Thoth's temple complex was extensive, Thoth's 4du. Though much has been lost to time and later destruction, archaeological evidence and ancient descriptions give us some sense of what it was like. The main temple was built and rebuilt over millennia, each pharaoh adding to or renovating the structure. By the late period, it was a massive complex with multiple courtyards, halls, and chambers, all decorated with reliefs and inscriptions honoring Thoth. Sacred lakes within the temple complex held water used for ritual purification. In and around these lakes lived ibises and baboons, the sacred animals of Thoth. These animals were not merely symbolic, but were understood as actual manifestations or servants of the god. They were treated with great reverence, fed and cared for by the priests. When they died, they were mummified and buried in special necropolises with full ritual honors. The practice of mummifying sacred animals was widespread in ancient Egypt but reached its peak in the late period. At Hermopolis and nearby sites, archaeologists have discovered massive catacombs containing hundreds of thousands of mummified ibises. These were not wild birds that happened to die, but birds specifically raised and sacrificed as offerings to Thoth. Pilgrims would come to Hermopolis, purchase an ibis, have it killed and mummified by the priests, and then deposit it in the catacombs as an offering to the god. This practice, which strikes modern sensibilities as strange or even cruel, was understood as a way of honoring Thoth by increasing the number of his sacred creatures in the afterlife. Baboons too were mummified and buried with honor. These large primates, difficult to keep and sometimes dangerous, were nevertheless maintained at the temple because of their association with Thoth. The sight of these animals greeting the sunrise must have been quite impressive to ancient pilgrims, confirming their belief in Thoth's presence and power. The priests of Thoth formed a specialized group within the Egyptian priesthood. They were responsible not only for the daily temple rituals but also for maintaining the temple library and scriptorium. Hermopolis was a center of learning, where young men came to train as scribes, where scholars studied ancient texts, where new compositions were created and copied. The priests of Thoth were therefore not only religious officials but also teachers, librarians, and scholars. The daily ritual in the temple followed the pattern common to Egyptian temples. At dawn, the high priest would open the shrine, awaken the god represented by his cult statue, clean and dress the statue, offer food and drink, and recite hymns. Throughout the day, additional rituals would be performed. At night, the shrine would be sealed again until the next morning. These daily rituals maintained the covenant between the god and his people, ensuring Thoth's continued blessing on the temple and the city. But the temple was not just a place for priestly ritual. Ordinary people came to the temple to ask questions of the oracle, to seek healing, to request Thoth's blessing on their endeavors, particularly those involving literacy or justice. Someone beginning a career as a scribe might come to ask Thoth's favor. Someone involved in a legal dispute might seek divine guidance. Someone suffering from an illness might request Thoth's healing power, particularly for ailments involving the eyes, mouth, or tongue, parts of the body associated with knowledge and communication. Festivals honoring Thoth punctuated the Egyptian calendar. The most important was the Festival of Thoth, held at the beginning of the first month of the Egyptian year, which was named for him. This festival marked the Egyptian New Year and honored Thoth's role in establishing and maintaining the calendar. Processions would carry Thoth's cult statue through the city. Offerings would be made. Schools would be closed or perhaps opened with special ceremonies. Sources differ. The festival celebrated Thoth's gifts to humanity and renewed the community's connection to the god. Other festivals occurred at different times of the year. The waxing and waning of the moon were natural times to honor the lunar god. The beginning of the inundation season, when the Nile flood brought new life to Egypt, was another time for festivals, as Thoth's measurement of time and his role in cosmic order were seen as essential to maintaining this life-giving cycle. Personal devotion to Thoth took many forms. Scribes, as we have mentioned, poured libations and said prayers before beginning their work. They kept small amulets or figurines of Thoth in their work areas. The most dedicated might have a small shrine in their homes, where they could make offerings and prayers directly to the god. Amulets in the shape of the ibis or bearing Thoth's name were popular forms of personal protection. These could be worn around the neck or kept on one's person. They invoked Thoth's wisdom and protection, particularly against deceit, ignorance, and injustice. Since Thoth was the god of truth, his amulet would protect against lies and help the wearer speak persuasively and truthfully. The Wadjet eye, the eye of Horus that Thoth had healed, was another powerful amulet closely associated with Thoth, even though it was Horus's eye. This symbol, one of the most common in ancient Egypt, represented healing, wholeness, and protection. It was painted on coffins, carved into temple walls, worn as jewelry, and used in funerary contexts. Every time an Egyptian used this symbol, they invoked the story of how Thoth healed what was broken, restored what was lost, and brought wholeness from fragmentation. The cult of Thoth evolved over the 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian civilization. In the Old Kingdom, he was already important, associated with the moon and with writing. By the Middle Kingdom, his role in the afterlife judgment had become well established, and the Book of the Dead texts that invoked his aid were widespread. In the New Kingdom, his connection to royal power and his role in maintaining Ma'at became especially prominent, as the increasingly complex imperial bureaucracy needed his patronage more than ever. In the late period, as Egypt came under foreign domination from Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Greeks, Thoth's cult actually grew in importance. This was partly because literacy and scribal skills became even more valuable in a cosmopolitan, multicultural context. Egyptian scribes who could read and write not only Egyptian but also Aramaic and Greek were essential to administration and commerce. These scribes honored Thoth as the source of all linguistic ability, the god who had invented not just Egyptian writing but the principle of writing itself. But the late period also saw the rise of a new phenomenon, the identification of Thoth with the Greek god Hermes. This syncretism, the blending of Greek and Egyptian deities, would have profound consequences not just for Thoth's cult, but for the entire history of Western esotericism. But to understand this development properly, we must first understand who Hermes was and why the Greeks saw him as equivalent to Thoth. Hermes was the Greek god of many things: boundaries and transitions, travelers and merchants, thieves and tricksters, messages and communication, the psychopomp who guided souls to the underworld, and the patron of clever speech and interpretation. He was not originally a god of writing or wisdom in the way Thoth was. Those roles belonged more to Athena and Apollo in the Greek pantheon. But Hermes had qualities that made him recognizable to the Greeks as similar to the Egyptian god they encountered in their travels. Both Thoth and Hermes were associated with the moon, though less prominently for Hermes. Both were connected to writing and communication. Both served as messengers and mediators. Both had roles in the afterlife, guiding souls to judgment. Both were known for cleverness and magical knowledge. These similarities, though not exact equivalences, were enough for the Greeks to identify the two gods with each other. This identification was facilitated by the Egyptian practice of interpretatio Graeca, the interpretation of foreign gods through the lens of Greek religion. When the Greeks encountered Egyptian religion, they did not see it as completely foreign, but rather as a different way of understanding the same divine realities they knew from their own tradition. Zeus was identified with Amun, Apollo with Horus, Ares with Set, and Hermes with Thoth. The city of Kmun, Thoth's cult center, was renamed Hermopolis, City of Hermes, a name that stuck and is still used today. But this was not a simple equation. The Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth were not identical, and their merger created something new: Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, a figure who combined the wisdom of Thoth with the cleverness of Hermes and added philosophical dimensions from both cultures. This syncretic deity would become central to Hermeticism, a religious and philosophical tradition that claimed to preserve the ancient wisdom of Egypt in Greek form. The Hermetic texts, written in Greek in Egypt during the early centuries of the Common Era, presented themselves as the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. They covered a wide range of topics: cosmology, theology, magic, astrology, alchemy, and spiritual transformation. These texts were deeply influenced by Platonism, Stoicism, and other Greek philosophical traditions, but they also drew on Egyptian religious concepts, particularly ideas about the divine nature of knowledge, the power of the word, and the possibility of spiritual ascent. The most famous Hermetic text is the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of Greek treatises attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. The first treatise, known as the Poimandres, describes a mystical vision in which the narrator encounters the divine mind and receives teachings about the creation of the cosmos and the nature of humanity. These teachings blend Egyptian creation theology, particularly the emphasis on creative speech that we saw in the Memphis theology, with Greek philosophical concepts about the divine mind or logos. Another important Hermetic text is the Asclepius, preserved in Latin, which describes Egyptian religious practices and temple worship while also presenting philosophical teachings about the nature of God, the cosmos, and the human soul. This text famously declares that Egypt is an image of heaven, a place where divine truths are visible on earth through the worship and wisdom practiced there. The Emerald Tablet, a short text attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, became foundational for medieval alchemy. Its famous phrase, "as above, so below," expressed the Hermetic understanding of correspondence between the macrocosm and microcosm, between the heavens and the earth, between the divine and the human. This principle, which has roots in Egyptian thought, would influence Western esotericism for centuries. As Christianity became dominant in the Mediterranean world, and eventually became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the old gods were officially abandoned. Temples were closed or converted to churches. Pagan worship was outlawed, the priests dispersed or converted. The last hieroglyphs were carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Isis at Philae, and with them the ability to read Egyptian writing was gradually lost. But Thoth did not simply disappear, he transformed. As Hermes Trismegistus, he lived on in the Hermetic tradition. Medieval and Renaissance scholars, seeking ancient wisdom to supplement Christian teaching, turned to the Hermetic texts as repositories of Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology that supposedly predated Greek philosophy and even anticipated Christian revelation. They believed that Hermes Trismegistus was a real historical figure, a contemporary of Moses or even earlier, who had received divine revelation and recorded it for posterity. This belief gave the Hermetic texts immense authority. They were translated into Latin and studied alongside scripture and classical philosophy. Figures like Marsilio Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum and considered it essential to understanding divine truth. The Hermetic vision of a cosmos infused with divine wisdom, in which human beings could ascend to knowledge of God through study and spiritual practice, appealed to Renaissance humanists who sought to reconcile ancient wisdom with Christian faith. Even after Isaac Casaubon demonstrated in 1614 that the Hermetic texts were not ancient Egyptian but products of the early Common Era, interest in Hermeticism did not die. The texts continued to be studied and valued, now as examples of late ancient thought rather than as direct transmissions from Egyptian antiquity. And the connection to Thoth, though understood differently, remained important. These were texts that grew out of the Egyptian religious tradition. Even if written in Greek and influenced by Greek philosophy, the magical and alchemical traditions of the Middle Ages and Renaissance drew heavily on Hermetic ideas and through them on Egyptian magical concepts ultimately derived from Thoth. The use of divine names in magic, the belief in the power of written talismans, the practice of invoking angelic or demonic beings through correct use of their names and seals, all of these can be traced back to Egyptian magical practice under Thoth's patronage. Alchemy, the quest to transform base metals into gold and to discover the elixir of life, was understood as a Hermetic art, practiced under the guidance of Hermes Trismegistus. Alchemists saw their work as both physical and spiritual, seeking to transform not only metals but also the human soul. This dual nature of alchemical transformation echoed the Egyptian understanding of knowledge as both practical and sacred, as both technique and divine gift, as both science and magic. In the modern era, Thoth has experienced yet another revival. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw a surge of interest in ancient Egyptian religion, spurred partly by the decipherment of hieroglyphs, following the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, and partly by various occult and esoteric movements that looked to ancient Egypt as a source of spiritual wisdom. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, one of the most influential Western magical orders, drew extensively on Egyptian symbolism and claimed to transmit ancient Egyptian magical practices. Their rituals invoked Egyptian deities including Thoth, whom they understood as the god of wisdom and hidden knowledge. Their teachings about magic, Kabbalah, and spiritual transformation were presented as part of an ancient tradition going back to Egypt. Aleister Crowley, the influential and controversial ceremonial magician, created the Thoth Tarot, a tarot deck explicitly designed to express Hermetic and Egyptian symbolism. The deck, painted by Lady Frida Harris under Crowley's direction, presents Thoth as a central figure representing wisdom, communication, and magical power. This deck remains popular among tarot readers today. The New Age movement has also embraced Thoth, often presenting him as an ascended master or cosmic teacher who communicated ancient wisdom to early civilizations and who continues to guide spiritual seekers. Books claiming to channel Thoth or to present his teachings have found audiences among those interested in ancient astronaut theories, channeling, and alternative spirituality. Academic Egyptology, meanwhile, has continued to study the historical Thoth as understood in ancient Egyptian religion. Scholars have examined the evolution of his cult, the development of texts attributed to him, his role in various mythological cycles, and his importance in Egyptian concepts of kingship, justice, and the afterlife. This academic study provides a valuable counterbalance to more speculative or fantastical interpretations, grounding our understanding of Thoth in careful examination of ancient sources. What is remarkable is that Thoth has remained relevant across all these different contexts and eras. As an ancient Egyptian deity, he was worshipped for thousands of years. As Hermes Trismegistus, he shaped medieval and Renaissance thought. As a figure in modern occultism and New Age spirituality, he continues to fascinate and inspire. Few, if any, other ancient deities can claim such continuous influence over such a long span of time. This enduring relevance speaks to something fundamental about what Thoth represents. He is the god of knowledge, and humans have always sought knowledge. He is the god of writing, and writing has been essential to civilization for 5,000 years. He is the god of wisdom, and the quest for wisdom is perhaps the most characteristically human of all pursuits. He is the god of truth, and truth matters in every age, in every culture, in every context. The story of Thoth is ultimately the story of humanity's relationship with knowledge itself. In honoring Thoth, the ancient Egyptians were honoring the human capacity to learn, to understand, to record, to remember, to judge wisely, to speak truthfully. These capacities made civilization possible. They distinguished humans from animals. They allowed each generation to build upon the achievements of previous generations rather than starting from scratch. When a young scribe in ancient Egypt poured a libation to Thoth before beginning to write, he was acknowledging this deep truth, that the ability to read and write was not merely a technical skill but a sacred gift, a participation in divine wisdom. When a priest recorded the verdict of the weighing of the heart, he was making permanent and unchangeable what might otherwise be disputed or forgotten. When the priests at Hermopolis taught theology and astronomy, they were passing on knowledge that stretched back thousands of years, knowledge that had been carefully preserved and transmitted through Thoth's gift of writing. This understanding of knowledge as sacred, as connected to truth and justice, as essential to maintaining cosmic order, is perhaps ancient Egypt's greatest contribution to human civilization. And Thoth embodied this understanding. He was not just a god whom scribes happened to worship. He was the principle that knowledge matters, that truth is sacred, that wisdom should be sought and honored, that writing preserves and protects what is valuable, that justice requires accurate record-keeping and fair judgment. These principles remain relevant today. We still need accurate records, fair judgment, truthful communication, and the wise application of knowledge. We still face the challenge of maintaining truth in the face of falsehood, justice in the face of oppression, order in the face of chaos. We still need writers and record keepers, teachers and judges, scholars and scientists, all the modern equivalents of the ancient scribes who served under Thoth's patronage. In our modern technological age, information has become more abundant than ever before. We have access to more knowledge, more quickly than any previous generation could have imagined. But this abundance brings its own challenges. How do we distinguish truth from falsehood? How do we maintain accurate records when anyone can publish anything online? How do we ensure that justice is done when misinformation spreads so quickly? How do we preserve what is valuable when data can be lost or corrupted? These are the questions that Thoth, in a sense, was invented to address. He represents the human aspiration to get things right, to record accurately, to judge fairly, to preserve truth. That aspiration is as relevant now as it was 5,000 years ago on the banks of the Nile. The ancient Egyptians are gone, their language is dead, spoken by no one. Their temples are ruins, tourist attractions rather than living centers of worship. Their religion has not been actively practiced for nearly 2,000 years. But what they understood about knowledge, truth, and wisdom continues to shape how we think about these things today. And Thoth, the god who embodied their highest aspirations about knowledge and wisdom, continues to represent those aspirations for us. Whether we think of him as a deity, as a mythological figure, as a cultural symbol, or as a personification of certain human ideals, Thoth matters. His story matters. What he represented to the ancient Egyptians, and what he continues to represent in various forms today, touches on fundamental questions about what it means to be human, what knowledge is for, why truth matters, and how we can build and maintain civilizations that honor these values. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson we can take from the entire story of Thoth. The pursuit of knowledge, the commitment to truth, the maintenance of justice, the accurate recording of what occurs, the transmission of wisdom from one generation to the next. These are not merely practical necessities, they are sacred duties. They are what make us human in the fullest sense. They are what allow civilization to exist and flourish. And they are what connect us, across thousands of years, to the ancient Egyptians who first carved Thoth's image in stone and who first poured libations to the god of wisdom. The story of Thoth, then, is not just an interesting tale from ancient mythology. It is a story about ourselves, about our highest aspirations, about what we value and why we value it. It is a story that began 5,000 years ago but has not yet ended, because as long as humans seek knowledge, pursue truth, value wisdom, and maintain justice, the principles that Thoth embodied will remain alive. If you enjoyed this journey through the mythology and history of Thoth, the ancient Egyptian god of wisdom, writing, and truth, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating content that explores the fascinating world of ancient history and mythology. And if you have suggestions for future topics you'd like us to cover, leave them in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may your path be lit with wisdom.